Well, Meta has been one of the year's hottest stocks. The parent company of Facebook has seen its shares climb more than 160% in 2023. Thanks in part to a rebound in big tech, but also Meta's commitment to bottom-line discipline. But while its stock has been hot, Meta is back in hot water with society overall as worries around misinformation on its platforms during the Israel-Gaza war continue to grow. Jim Anderson is a longtime social media watcher and the CEO of Beacon, an AI software company, and he joins us with more on this developing story. Jim, does it surprise you to see Meta back in the headlines for all the wrong reasons?
No, John, it really doesn't, and primarily because this has always been a game of whack-a-mole, right? Content creation has never been cheaper or easier, especially with AI. So whether you're doing it for ideological reasons or just pure profit motives, if you want to create false content and put it out on Facebook or Twitter/X, TikTok, wherever, it's a lot easier than it's ever been.
So my question to you was going to be, for a company of this size and scale, why is this still an issue? Why is it still happening? Hearing what you're saying, maybe that's part of the business model.
It could be. It's interesting. I suspect you're going to see and hear of plenty of conversations inside of Meta saying, why is this happening? We're investing a tremendous amount of resources in trying to combat this. So what have they done? How is it that 750,000 fake pieces of content have been created? What do we need to do to step up our game? So my suspicion is somebody found an attack vector, created a lot of content. Facebook then had to respond. And of course, the EU was unhappy about that. But I would be wary about drawing too many long-term conclusions. I think if you ask yourself in 3 days, 7 days, 14 days, who's doing a pretty good job of this, I'd have to believe Meta, just from the sheer amount of resources they've invested in this. They'll probably be doing better than some other platforms.
I mean, we do cover all of the platforms. It's interesting, though, this one is so big and so public, i.e. a public company at this point, right? What used to be Twitter, now X, is a private company. TikTok is, private enterprise. So does that put more pressure, do you think, on Mark Zuckerberg to make sure that they get things right?
Yeah, John, it sure does. I mean, they are bigger, just in every possible measure, they dwarf those other companies. They are public. They have and should have a higher degree of expectation. So I think if you want to imagine that they're graded on a curve, their curve is going to be more harsh, and people have and should have much higher expectations on what they're able to do. This
is a company that, yes, they have the Meta name now, but I think in the markets, people have rewarded them for shifting away, at least for now, from the metaverse and leading into this big AI excitement, which has been one of the biggest stories of the year. But I wonder, again, with AI, are there complications when it comes to something like what we're talking about, misinformation?
With all new technologies, we've seen this, John, right? It's a wonderful new technology. I'm a huge AI optimist, but I also try not to be naive, right? There are bad actors out there who will use AI and every other technological advancement badly. And so I think there's a real arms race, if you will, between those who want to use AI for good and those who don't want to use AI for good or for their own self-interest. And I think it's incredibly important. Whereas social media, you could say, well, some people have just gotten over social media. That doesn't have maybe a broader societal impact. AI affects every sector of the economy, as you know, transportation, healthcare, construction, manufacturing. And so if we start to have backlashes against AI because of what's happening on social media, I think the consequence of that is much, much more significant than just a backlash against social media.
Oh, that's an interesting consideration. Jim, good to have you back with us. Appreciate your time. Jim Anderson, CEO of Beacon, joining us.
Ottawa is expected to move forward with new regulations aimed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, despite Friday's Supreme Court ruling that said the government overstepped with its Impact Assessment Act. How will provinces respond if the federal government decides to go ahead with more? For more on this, we're joined by Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta. Danielle, Premier, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Great to speak with you on this because actually you've been quite busy the past few days. I'm sure you're busy all the time. But when we're talking about this Impact Assessment Act being ruled against by the Supreme Court of Canada, what sort of an impact do you expect that to have in some future discussions when it comes to, the federal government wanting to go ahead with an emissions cap on the oil and gas industry? And also it's a clean electricity regulations. What sort of impact do you think that ruling on Friday could end up having on those efforts?
Well, I hope that the federal government reads the ruling, as I have been, because the Supreme Court makes it very clear that the Constitution matters, that there are division of powers, The court expects those to be respected. They don't want one level of government using a workaround to try to regulate indirectly what they're not allowed to do directly. And they have an expectation of cooperative federalism. Their view in the judgment is that we have equal powers to regulate the environment. And they assert that the province also has the ability to be passing these kinds of policies. And we have taken that approach right from the beginning. I have attempted with our federal counterparts to work with them on a 2050 carbon neutrality target. And I'm hoping that they come to the table with a new, renewed spirit of cooperative federalism rather than thinking they can act unilaterally.
Yeah, quite a different target than the federal government would like in terms of the timeline there. But when you're talking about that sort of, equal responsibility, that it is a shared jurisdiction, the environment is, and the ruling on Friday saying that it's unconstitutional, that this was provincial territory. But when you're thinking about the oil and gas emissions cap or the clean electricity, do you see those as being provincial territory then?
100%. I mean, it's quite clear in Section 92, the ability to develop our natural resources and develop conservation policies around them. It's written right there as exclusive provincial jurisdiction. Same with electricity. It's written right in our Constitution that electricity is also provincial jurisdiction for a good reason. It's because every province has its own natural endowments, and we have the expertise to be able to determine what the pace of development should be and what the best policies around that are. The federal government is well beyond not only their constitutional ability, but also beyond their practical ability. They just don't know these sectors, and therefore they should be working with us to achieve the joint objective of reducing emissions. I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that our energy sector has been a leader on emissions reduction. We phased out coal already 7 years earlier than the 2030 defined target. We also were the first to develop emissions pricing around industrial emissions. And we have a number of our industrial players that have net zero by 2050 targets. So we're being responsible. We're approaching the table in a spirit of cooperative federalism. And I hope the federal government takes this judgment and decides to do the same.
So if the federal government does move forward with its emissions cap and the clean electricity regulations, what would your moves be?
Well, we won't follow it. I mean, I think the Supreme Court has made it pretty clear that we have the jurisdiction to be able to regulate our resources in our own way. And anything that comes through that is a cap that is unrealistic, unachievable, and the technology is not there is a de facto production cap. And they're not allowed to do that. So we, again, have always approached this with a spirit of cooperation. It was the first conversation I had with the Prime Minister. I established an emissions reduction plan in April. I asked if we could come together for a joint panel. We've got deputy ministers in Ottawa as we speak, talking with their counterparts. And we have been doing the hard work of figuring out what those abatement curves should look like so that we can achieve the milestones. That's what cooperative federalism looks like. And that's what we've been doing. We just hope that the federal government comes to the table with that same spirit so that we can actually make some real progress and stop the fight. I think industry wants to see the federal and provincial government working together. But I must tell you that if they're going to continue to put forward unilateral policy, I'm going to continue to fight back against it.
Another potential project that you've been working on recently, Premier, has been the possibility of an Alberta pension plan. And you had a town hall over the phone last night. It sounds like a lot of callers, a lot of interested people in getting some details on the plan. But all of the details aren't really out there yet. They're not really defined at this point. Do you have a timeline of when people would be able to expect to get, the minutia of how this is going to work or how it could work?
Well, we have all of the details on albertapensionplan.ca. We are looking at the legislation, which defines how the distribution of assets should work, which would entitle Alberta to $334 billion. And that would allow for about a $1,400 saving per person and $1,400 saving per employee, or it could allow us to increase benefits. We're going to make sure with legislation in the fall that any decision is put to the people in a referendum, should they choose, that we will have an equivalent or better benefits or equivalent or lower contributions, and we'll let Albertans decide. This has been a conversation that has happened in our province going all the way back to 2001, is how does Alberta assert the same rights that Quebec has? Quebec has its own pension plan, they collect their own taxes, they have their own police force, they have their own immigration system. And I think that this is just a conversation that's been in the works for a long time. I'm just completing the work that my predecessors started, and we'll leave it to Albertans to make the choice.
What is the math on how Alberta would be entitled to that 53% of the CPP assets? Because I do think that is a question that people still have.
Yeah, what we have looked at is the legislation. We ended up bringing forward a actuary who can do the analysis on this, and it's the over-contributions that Albertans have made since the inception of the plan, along with the compounded interest. And that's the reason why we ended up with that number. So we're going forward on that basis and consulting on that basis. We've written a letter to, or are in the process of writing a letter to the finance minister to get their response to it. And that's what we're consulting on right now.
Some of the callers suggested that some of the questions, I guess, in an online survey, they didn't give an option to say whether they weren't interested in an Alberta pension plan just for the province itself. There wasn't a question that said yes or no, essentially, that it was, what do you think of this idea for this pension plan versus, having that opportunity to say, I don't like the idea. I don't think it is a good idea. Do you think is that going to be part of a future survey? Is that just sort of the beginning? Or do you think that you might have worded it a bit differently now that you've heard the reaction to it?
Well, I think people need to understand what the implications are. Change of anything is always complicated, and I wanted to make sure that people understood the amount of assets we were entitled to, the extent of our overpayment, the fact that this overpayment is just going to continue on and on year after year, and the compounding going to continue on and on year after year. And already it's a very significant amount of savings that we would have for our ratepayers, or a significant amount of increase of benefits for our seniors. So I think people need to know that kind of information. And if they still say no, then I respect the will of the people. But I think that there hasn't been that information that has been out in the past. We want to get that out there. And then we'll take advice from our panel on whether or not we should proceed to a referendum, depending on the feedback we get.
Okay, so a referendum, it will depend on what your panel decides, and then it would go definitely to a referendum if you were going to move ahead with the pension.
Correct. I mean, they're coming back with a report for us on, I believe, May of 2024 to give us advice on whether they think that there is an appetite to put it to a vote. But that would be the only way that we'd make the change, is a referendum to the people. Okay.
Premier, thanks so much for joining us today. Lots to talk about these days. Really appreciate it. That was Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta.
Well, there's all kinds of talk about Ozempic these days. It's a diabetes drug which is often prescribed by doctors off-brand for treatment of weight loss as well. And more and more publicly traded companies are saying there could be implications to their business if weight loss through Ozempic becomes a big trend. Let's bring in, for insight, Madison Muller of Bloomberg. Madison, thanks a lot for joining us. You've written an interesting piece on this. What are some of the interesting things being studied in this regard?
Yeah, well, people might remember recently, last week, Novo Nordisk said that they were actually stopping a trial of Ozempic early because of its success in treating kidney disease. And so that sort of set off this frenzy, I think, in the market where dialysis stocks were plunging, and people were wondering what other sectors of the healthcare industry, what other diseases, are being studied with Ozempic and Wegovy and Eli Lilly's drug Mounjaro. And so we sort of looked at that and looked at all the different studies that are happening right now, from heart disease to liver disease to kidney disease to even Alzheimer's. Some of them seem relatively straightforward. They're related to obesity or diabetes, but some of them, like Alzheimer's, might be, it's sort of harder to imagine how those things could be affected by a weight loss drug.
Do you think the market's gotten ahead of itself in some of these other sectors? Like, we're seeing consumer products companies and beer companies, their valuations get crushed on the back of this. Do you think the market's jumped the gun a little bit, or how realistic is this could be the miracle drug?
Yeah, that's something we've talked about a lot. That's something I've been talking to analysts about. It's early. Like, we really don't know the long-term implications of this yet. The drugs are very expensive, and the utilization would have to be pretty high to get to this point where we're seeing all of these other industries being affected. And oftentimes insurance in the United States also doesn't cover the drugs. And so there's some issues with that there. But yeah, it's interesting to hear, Walmart saying that it's affecting their consumers, and all of these other companies, snack companies, saying that they're thinking about GLP-1 drugs. The effects could be really far-reaching. So it's definitely a bit early, though.
And there's a Canadian connection here as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Daniel Drucker, who is a professor at the University of Toronto, he is one of the early discoverers of the GLP-1 hormone, which is what these drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy are based off of. And he was one of the first, with a team of other scientists in Boston, to find that this gut hormone could actually, had like an effect on the brain and could decrease insulin. And so all of these later discoveries and drugs were sort of based off of those early findings. And, he's still regarded as one of the sort of preeminent experts on the GLP-1 hormone. So is still doing a lot of work at University of Toronto.
Madison, thanks a great deal for this. That's Madison Muller. She's with Bloomberg News, has written a detailed piece on the Bloomberg terminal on Ozempic and its implications in other sectors.
One of Canada's furthest offshore islands in the Atlantic Ocean is showing signs that extreme weather is impacting natural fresh water stores. We have more in this report from CTV News.
A thin crescent of sand almost 200 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia, Sable Island may be surrounded by ocean, but inland, its fresh water has always been at a premium, never more so perhaps until now. The animals here depend on it. The quality and quantity of the groundwater last studied almost a half-century ago. Decades of storms and erosion taking a toll.
The goal of my work was to go back to the island and make repeat measurements to see if there had been change since the 1970s.
And so a team of Dalhousie University researchers placed sophisticated equipment there, helping them see fresh water underground. It comes from rainfall that gets stored in the sand, a supply now threatened where dunes have disappeared and as powerful weather keeps bringing salt water in.
So in areas where the dunes were completely lost, we saw complete loss of the fresh groundwater, so a loss of up to 10 meters.
So if over time potentially the part of Sable Island that's eroding could experience more and more saltwater intrusion into the coming decades.
The ecosystem usually flushes the salt water out, but frequent hurricanes and other storms means less time for that and less fresh water to be found.
And over time, that seawater encroaches further and further landward.
The researchers say their work not only has implications for understanding the changes happening on Sable Island, but also for other islands around the world and coastal communities.
We can take those findings and apply them in other places where coastlines are changing. And so even here in Nova Scotia, we have issues of saltwater intrusion into our coastal wells.
A lesson to be learned from a place where a precious resource may become even more scarce. Heidi Petrocic, CTV News, Halifax.
The Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, urging Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, to reject RBC's proposed takeover of HSBC Canada. Mr. Poilievre says that deal would reduce banking competition when homeowners are already facing high borrowing costs. Let's bring in Mike Vanoker, Portfolio Manager at MV Wealth Partners with IA Private Wealth. Great to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
What is your take? Should Ottawa block that takeover?
I could see Mr. Poilievre's opinion and the way he's thinking about it. The banking sector in Canada is very concentrated. We have, 6 major banks, a few of the minor banks. HSBC built its franchise out, became a pretty good player, to my knowledge, has been serving business customers very well. Now, all of a sudden, I think the worry is A, consumer and business choice, and B, does it come with job cuts? as these things sometimes do when you have economies of scale and two entities like this merging.
You're being cautious there. You don't have a strong take on whether it would lessen choice for consumers and businesses.
Of course, it probably would lessen the choice.
Yes.
Having said that, in Canada, we've basically had 6 major banks for a very long time. So at the end of the day, no, I don't have a very strong opinion whether it should or shouldn't go forward. However, I will say that while the U.S. has, I don't know, 3, 4, 5,000 banks, that's too many. Perhaps Canada would be better off with having more consumer and business choice.
Speaking of banking, you like the look of Citigroup stock, which has lagged peers.
It has. Citigroup has been mired in this dynamic of restructuring for a very long time, especially since the famous words of Chuck Prince, "We got to dance while the music is going." That was his quote before, the whole thing collapsed.
The legendary leader of Citigroup.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Jane Fraser, who is the new leader, I really like what she's doing. This is not a quick fix story to make money. This is a 2 to 5 years out. Today, you're buying something at $40 that has, as of last quarter, which they just reported last week, $87 of tangible book. That means that at quarter end, if they sold off all of the assets, paid off all of the debt, we as shareholders would get $87, give or take, and the stock's at $40.
Whoa.
The book value, which is accounting value, is even higher than that, right? Because of some adjustments. So if you believe in the franchise, and if you believe in the fact that they have a wad of capital, they've been raising their CET capital, I believe at last quarter was 13.5 now, which is extremely high. You're getting a 5% or so dividend yield. You're starting to get buybacks. She is making lots of moves to trim the management organization, reduce costs, compete where they really can compete, which is in the institutional space. I think there's a lot of upside and very little downside here.
Let's get into the broad market. I know it's always such a wide topic that it's hard to know what to focus on, but you think a lot of the risks facing equities have been priced in?
I'd like to think so. The market is a discounting mechanism, and so we've had a war in Ukraine, we've had this fear of recession, we had the fear of a government default, then the fear of a government shutdown in the U.S., then we had a fear of inflation not abating. Now we have the government spending out of control, and on top of that, a new theater of war in Israel. And the markets are not doing well on the surface. In other words, there's a lot of stocks that are not doing well, but the broad markets have sort of been keeping it together thanks to the Magnificent Seven.
Sorry, let's put up a 5-year chart for the S&P. Please continue.
Sure.
Yeah.
But we think that perhaps there are a lot of beaten down companies that have great businesses, that have moats around them, that pay very nice dividends. And even in this environment, if you have a lens of 1 to 3 years out, represent a lot of value as compared to some of these, dare I say, growth equities, which are still potentially priced to perfection.
So you're looking for things, just unloved Cinderellas on the market that just haven't had enough attention.
Absolutely.
Dividend yield, is that important to you?
It is, because we like to get paid while we wait. The issue in investing is you can't time things perfectly, and you never know, how long it's going to take for your thesis to play out. So at least if you're getting cash flow, you're getting paid to wait. You can reinvest that dividend into something else, or even drip the shares to get even more of what you already like.